I was once a very wishy-washy Christian when I found myself sitting on a plane next to a pastor. And the pastor asked me, "Who am I describing? He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities." And I thought, oh my gosh, that's Jesus. Now, where is that in the New Testament? Well, of course, it wasn't in the New Testament. It is the forbidden passage in the Old Testament. Many Jewish people who are Orthodox Jews are not familiar with Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 was written during the lifetime of the prophet Isaiah by Isaiah, and Isaiah is also something that's been recorded quite well in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, probably what they call the Great Dead Sea Scrolls, we have Isaiah present, and I have an English translation, which we're going to go through today, and we're going to identify all of the places that are talking about the suffering servant and God's anointed one. And we're going to reference Isaiah 53, of course, but we're also going to take a look at some of the passages in Isaiah that were very prophetic. You can't tell a prophecy unless you have divine knowledge of the future. And of course, only God has that knowledge of the future. He's concurrently in our past, present, and future, and he has that knowledge. So here we go. If you take a look right here, you can see I'm looking at the first scroll present in this Bible translation. And so let's just go through it and see exactly what was going on. Now, just to put this into context, Isaiah was written around the time that the Assyrians had taken Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, into exile. So it was right around 740 BC. So Isaiah was around during that time. And then, of course, Isaiah foretold the fact that King Cyrus was going to also be freeing up Israel, freeing up the Jewish people. And of course, that was during the time of 539 BC. So you can see that Isaiah was written well before King Cyrus was even born. And the fascinating thing is Isaiah predicted that King Cyrus was going to be the one to free up the Israelites. So we're going to talk about that today as well, because it's really cool stuff. So I wanted to say that, no, I haven't mentioned Josephus yet. So Josephus, of course, is also a Jewish historian who was born in the year 37, and Josephus made a lot of mention of what was in the Old Testament. But before I get to that, I want to say hi, Charlie Reed and Erica Hubner. Great to see you guys. Thanks for coming today. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Where I am today in Florida, it's the coolest day it's been since last spring. It's really nice outside today, and so I'm pretty excited about that. Very sunny, very nice, and just a wonderful day. Not nearly as sweat producing as it is normal. So I have been able to take a bike ride and a walk without even cracking any sweat barely. So it's been a good deal. But anyway, so here we go to Isaiah 1. Now take a note of this. Here's what we know about the nation of Israel. I feel like I'm going to sneeze. So if I come on with a sneeze, and you'll know. Okay, so this is how Isaiah was describing the nation of Israel as God had told him. Verse 4, and I'm looking here right from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The reason I'm going to the Dead Sea Scrolls is because they've dated these to the 2nd century BC. And so any sort of changes in the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been recorded by later Masoretic texts came about way later. So hundreds of years later, when the Masoretes came up with their texts around 1000 AD. So there are some very tiny differences between the Dead Sea Scrolls and what's in the current Hebrew texts. And of course, as you know, the current Hebrew texts, the Masoretes texts from around 1000 AD, were the ones that were used in many of the English translations of the Bible. But there's some really important differences. They're important, and I will note them too today. But that's why I'm going to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it says, "Ah, sinful nation, a people loaded with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly. They have forsaken Yahweh. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are estranged and backwards." So we know that the description of Israel is that, and the people of Israel, is that they're loaded with iniquity and they're sinful. Keep that in mind, because now we're going to get to some more passages. So let's move forward, and I'm just going to zoom up now to Isaiah 42. I'm skipping right over. You're going to notice I'm skipping over the passage 7:14, which refers to the maiden, the young woman, or the virgin who was going to give birth to Emmanuel. I'm also skipping over Isaiah 9:6. Those are also very important passages, but today I'm going to focus more on the passages revealed from Isaiah 52 and 53, but in 42 too. So here's what you see in Isaiah 42. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit on him. He will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout, nor raise his voice, nor cause it to be heard in the street. He won't break a bruised reed. He won't quench a dimly burning wick. He will faithfully bring justice, and he will not fail, nor be discouraged until he has set justice in the earth, and the islands will wait for his law. Okay, so we see Isaiah 42 referring to this servant. Now, what do we know about the servant? He's going to bring justice, and he's going to not say too much after that. So then we move ahead, and we're going to go to Isaiah 52:13, so we can learn a little bit more about the situation that's going on here. So I'll zoom ahead to that, so you can see, behold, my servant will deal wisely, and he will be exalted and lifted up, and will be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So you can see here, his appearance was marred. This is not talking about the nation of Israel. It's talking about a person whose appearance was marred. Okay, so he will cleanse many nations. Kings will shut their mouths at him, for they will see that which had not been told them, and they will understand that which they had not heard. Okay, so you can see that too. And I want to say hi, going back over to the chat. I see Timothy, Erica Hubner, still saying hi. Charlie Reed, great to see you guys again. Good to see you today. Erica's saying it's 57 degrees. Oh, that sounds beautiful. Northeast Wisconsin. I love Wisconsin. I have to say, there's one state in the Midwest that I really like, and it's because of all the lakes and all the beauty. And that's when we lived in Illinois. That's where we used to vacation. We always went up to Wisconsin. In fact, I've been to Lac du Flambeau in northern Wisconsin. I've also been to the Wisconsin Dells. I've been to Lake Geneva. I've been lots of places around there. So Wisconsin's definitely a good time. So, okay, so here we have Isaiah 53. Now, who is this? Who has believed our message? To whom has the arm of Yahweh been revealed? For he grew up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. Now you can cross-reference this root also with the stump of Jesse, the root of King David. So we knew that there is supposed to be a Messiah coming from David's lineage. Okay. Now, again, just so you can reference what time this was, King David was around 1,000 years before Christ. Okay, so this, again, just to remind you, is written around the year 740 BC. Okay, so this is far after King David lived. When we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Okay, so again, this cannot refer to Israel or to the Israelite people, because certainly some Israelite people are beautiful. And also Israel itself has many beautiful places. And so you can't say there's no beauty in Israel, but it's just saying that Jesus has no beauty. It's talking about the suffering servant. He was despised and rejected by men. Well, certainly we know that. We know that under the priests, under the high priest Caiaphas and Annas, they convicted him to crucifixion. And they did it because Jesus equated himself with the Messiah. He said, they asked him if he was the son of the mighty one. And he said, yes, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the mighty one, coming in the clouds of heaven. Direct references to Psalm 110 and to Daniel 7. And so, of course, this was the reason why they decided that he had blasphemed. He had put himself on the right hand of the mighty one, of the Ancient of Times. Okay. So they rejected him. Now, a man of suffering. Okay, it doesn't say it was Israel, a man of suffering, acquainted with disease. He was despised as one from whom men hide their face, and we didn't respect him. Now, again, just remember this, going back to talking about what happened during Jesus' time. You can notice in the Gospel of John, the people, the Pharisees, had been conspiring for a while to take Jesus down. Okay, they were conspiring, and Jesus had to go somewhat into hiding for a while until, of course, he presented himself as the Paschal Lamb during the Passion Week. On Monday of the Passion Week, he came into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, just as foretold by Zechariah in Zechariah 9:9. It said, you will see the humble one coming in riding on a donkey. And of course, who rides donkeys anymore? Ask the Jewish people. Who's riding around on donkeys? They expect that they're going to have two kinds of Messiah. Go back to their Sanhedrin 98a. You can see that they realized that there was the Messiah if they had not been acting well, If they were doing wrong, if they were still sinning, they would receive the Messiah that was going to be coming in riding on the donkey, versus if they were acting correctly, if they were not sinning, they would see the Messiah coming in the clouds of heaven. So they knew there were two types of Messiah. You can see this again in Sanhedrin 98a, the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, surely he has borne our sickness and carried our suffering, yet we considered him plagued, struck by God, and afflicted. Now remember, back then, the whole idea of the crucifixion, it was the most horrific punishment that anyone could be given. Even Tacitus talked about how Christ had been crucified. He had been given the ultimate punishment, okay, and that's the crucifixion. That's what Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, who was born in the year 56, this is what he recorded. He recorded the type of punishment Jesus received. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought our peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Okay, so only one without sin would be capable of curing people of their sins, or healing people, or forgiving people for sins. If you're sinning yourself, you're not in the place to be forgiving other people. But if you're not guilty of having any sins, then you're in a different kind of a place. You're capable of taking on the sins of others. Okay, so think about that. The Passover lamb had to also be without blemish. All we, like sheep, have gone away. Everyone has turned to his own way, and Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So let's go back to Yahweh has laid on him. There's two different parties involved him. It wouldn't make sense to say, and Yahweh has laid on Israel the iniquity of Israel, okay? Or, and Yahweh has laid on the nation of Israel the iniquity of the nation of Israel. This is specifically referring to one person taking on the sins of a group of people, okay? He was oppressed, yet when he was afflicted, he didn't open his mouth. Now, again, going back to what we just mentioned earlier in Isaiah 42. As a lamb that is led to the slaughter, as a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he didn't open his mouth. Now you recall when people were trying to get Jesus to speak, they were beating him, they were spitting on him, they were crowning him with thorns, they put a robe on him to mock him, they were circling around him, mocking him. Go back to Psalm 22 for a cross reference here. Jesus called our attention to both Psalm 22, where it speaks of the bulls of Bashan surrounding him and dividing up his clothes, and how they pierced his hands and feet. He said that. He called our attention to that when he said, my Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" when he was on the cross. And he also drew our attention to Psalm 31 while on the cross. And Psalm 31 says, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," which he said. Psalm 31 talks about how his companions abandoned him. And of course, we know that many of his disciples had abandoned him, including his key disciple, Peter, who not only abandoned him, but denied him 3 times. And then we had the other disciples, all but the women, and John, okay? John, who stood at the feet of Jesus. So that's pretty fascinating stuff. All right, so I want to say hi also to Kip Davis, who's in here. And so we're looking at the reasons for Isaiah 53 referring to the suffering servant, and I haven't even gotten to the best one yet. Okay, so he was taken away by oppression and judgment. Oh, wait, no, sorry, skipped Isaiah 7. He was oppressed, yet when he was afflicted, he didn't open his mouth, as a lamb that is led to the slaughter. Oh, I did read this part. And he didn't open his mouth. Okay, so then he was taken away by oppression and judgment. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living and stricken for the disobedience of my people? They made his grave with the wicked and with rich people in his death, although he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Okay, just remember this. Right up front in Isaiah 1:4 makes very clear that the Israelites, Israel and its people, were full of iniquity. Okay, and so we can see that this person clearly cannot be Israel or the Israelite people, because there's no deceit, no violence, none of that in this person. And there's another reference that's very similar to this in just a moment. But let's not forget, Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man, and he was a Pharisee. And it's rather embarrassing that rather than have Jesus' family or his disciples remove him from the cross and bury him, this Pharisee, this righteous Pharisee, got up and asked for permission from Pontius Pilate to bury Jesus, and he buried him in his tomb, just as Isaiah had predicted. Yet it pleased Yahweh to bruise him. He has caused him to suffer. When you make his soul an offering for sin, you will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and Yahweh's pleasure will prosper. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light and be satisfied. Now, this particular verse is one that Kip Davis is familiar with because a person he had worked under had made sure that this light reference has been brought into a certain English translation of the Bible. Okay, so you can see in the NIV, for example, it says he will see the light of life, but many English translations just says he will see. The Masoretes just say he will see. Again, just to remind you, the Masoretic texts were written around 1,000 years after Christ. Okay, so we've got that. He will see the light. Okay, so that is a direct reference to a resurrection. He saw the light, of course, and he was satisfied after he rose from the dead 3 days after he was suffered, crucified, and buried. Okay, my righteous servant will justify many by their knowledge of himself, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion with the great, and he will divide the plunder with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was counted with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sins of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Okay, so we can see right here, he made the intercession. He bore the sins of many. He, as a suffering servant, was within his full capabilities to take on the sins of others. Just to remind you, you can't take on the sins of others if you're busy sinning yourself. And Israel during this time was in captivity. The northern kingdom was in captivity under the Assyrians when Isaiah wrote his book. And then if you recall, in 586, we have the Babylonians in power, and the Jews had been taken into exile under the Babylonians as well. Okay, so they had gone into exile. And then King Cyrus allowed them to go back. And again, in 586, that's when the first temple was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. 586 was written way after Isaiah wrote his books. And in 539, King Cyrus came in there and he allowed the Jews to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild their temple. Okay, so let's take a look at this, because would you expect King Cyrus to show up in the book of Isaiah? Well, here's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so let's talk about what's happening. Now, we know also that Judah was taken into captivity under Babylon, okay, right around 609 to 605 BC. All right, so here's what it says in Isaiah. This is, let's get to what verse this is that I just found this. We will go back, Isaiah 44. Okay, so we've got Isaiah 44, and very fascinating stuff when we find this, okay. There we are, Cyrus. Okay, so let's see, Isaiah 44. Who frustrates the signs of the liars and makes diviners mad, who turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolish, who confirms the word of his servant and performs the counsel of his messengers, who says of Jerusalem, she will be inhabited, and the cities of Judah, they will be built. And I will raise up its waste places, who says to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up your rivers, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and shall perform all my pleasure. Even saying of Jerusalem, she will be built. And of the temple, your foundation will be laid. Now, doesn't it seem strange here? Think about this. This was written well after the first temple had been built by King Solomon, years and years before, right around 1000 BC. So this is written around 740 BC, referring to this temple and talking at how she will be built. And the foundation will be laid. Well, doesn't that seem kind of strange if the first temple is what's there? Well, of course, this did come to pass, because in 586, we have the first temple being destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. And then in 516, after Cyrus had initially called out to the Jewish people to let them know they could rebuild their temple, 516, the second temple had been completed. Okay, so very fascinating stuff. Here we have another reference to Cyrus. Yahweh says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and strip kings of their armor, to open the doors before him, and the gates shall not be shut. Okay, so it's very fascinating stuff. I hope you will enjoy this. And so I hope you've enjoyed this. Now, just to back up my point, I want to talk about some people who also have talked about Isaiah 53 at length. And one particular person, Dr. Michael Brown, who has who has a PhD in the ancient languages of Hebrew, for example. Dr. Michael Brown has looked into this at length and debated numerous rabbis on the passages in Isaiah. He's talked a lot about the context and the history and all of that kind of stuff. And so you can go over to his channel, Ask Dr. Brown, if you want further details, but he's made it all quite clear. And so I want to say thank you to everybody for coming in here. And I'm seeing that we have Kip Davis, who seems to not be realizing what Isaiah 53 has said quite clearly. But before we get to that, I wanted to go to one more passage that I just remembered. So Isaiah 61. This is interesting because in Luke 4:17, Jesus got up in the temple. And of course, we know from Malachi 3:1 that the Lord was to appear in the temple. Malachi was written around 400 BC, or in the 4th century BC. Okay, so Malachi was written around then and said the Lord was going to appear in the temple. Jesus got up into the temple and he read the people this: Yahweh's Spirit is on me because Yahweh has anointed me to preach good news to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to release to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, and to give them a garland for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of Yahweh, that he may be glorified. And Jesus said that this passage in Luke 4:17, he said this passage has been fulfilled. This is referring to Jesus. Now, just in case you're wondering whether Christians believe that Isaiah 53 is a direct reference to Jesus, just take a look at in the book of Acts when we had the person Philip on the road and he had to explain to somebody exactly what Isaiah 53 was about. Okay, so we have a reference also in the book of Acts to Isaiah 53 and how that suffering servant is Jesus. And of course, we also have Jesus on the road to Emmaus, where he encountered Cleopas and another disciple, and he explained to them all of the passages in the Old Testament that referred to him, starting from the books of Moses. Okay, quite a few times in the Gospels, Jesus makes a reference to the book of Moses. Okay, so that's also going back and refuting some of the stuff that people have said about the authorship of the first 5 books in the Bible, the Pentateuch. Okay, so I want to say thank you so much to everybody for coming in here. Please like, subscribe, and just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all in the glory of God. I also want to say hi to Otangelo. He was on my channel yesterday. Certainly want to take a look at that. And I said people can be without sin. No, people all fall short of the glory of God. So all fall short of the glory of God. Everyone sins. So no one is capable of taking on our sins who is human, who is fully human. So we've got someone who's human and divine, Jesus, who does not sin, did not sin, was the suffering servant, who was also the Passover lamb, the without blemish Passover lamb, took on our sins. Only one without sin can do that. That's all that it is. So thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, and do come again. And have a great day. Bye-bye. I'll be back tomorrow at 1:30 for an open mic. You guys want to join up tomorrow? Come battle it out. I've got 2 other Christians coming in here so far. So we'll see what else it is. But 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Come on in. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.